Deploy the fleet, now! Captain Kaleb Jarn's voice cracked through the tension in the bridge, sharp and decisive. The quiet hum of the Valiant systems surged around him, the calm before the storm. He wasn't waiting any longer. Every second counted. Lieutenant Daria Graves, ever composed, quickly issued the order, her voice tight with urgency. Fleet deployment initiated, Captain. We're all set. Kaleb watched as the bridge crew moved in perfect sync, their focus cutting through the air like blades. The ship's controls flickered and hummed, the command center alive with activity. He wasn't going to sit idly by and let the Von Empire dictate humanity's fate. They had pushed too far already. Prepare all weapon systems. Target their main fleet routes, Kaleb barked, not looking away from the view screen. His fingers drummed on the edge of his command console, a rhythmic echo in the sterile air. Space was silent, but this battle would be anything but. The tactical officer, Lieutenant Marco Talbot, was already scanning the incoming data. Captain, we've got confirmation. The Von Empire has just mobilized their strike forces. They're not wasting any time. Good, Kaleb muttered, his lips curling into a grim smile. Let them come. We'll show them the strength of humanity. His voice, low and resolute, barely held back the growing fire inside him. This wasn't just about survival, it was about taking their place in the galaxy. And that, Kaleb knew, would be forged in blood. A heavy weight settled on his chest. His mind was already miles ahead, calculating tactics, preparing for the unpredictability of war. He hadn't come this far to fail, not when Earth had entrusted him with this fleet. Captain, Daria's voice broke his thoughts. We have incoming fire on the edge of our fleet. Small skirmishers. No match for our defenses, but engage them. Don't give them a chance to regroup. Kaleb's command was immediate, his voice unyielding. There was no room for hesitation. The bridge shuddered slightly as the ship's engines roared to life, the vibrations crawling through Kaleb's boots. A momentary pulse, like the first beat of a drum, set the rhythm for what was to come. The Valiant and its fleet were more than ready. The Von thought they could toy with humanity. They had no idea what they had started. Targets locked, Captain, Talbot reported, his fingers flying over the controls. Kaleb turned to face the tactical display, his gaze unblinking as the red icons of enemy ships lit up across the screen, each one a challenge, a reminder that this war would test everything they had. He could feel the weight of the decision settling deeper into his bones. He was responsible for every life out there, every ship in his fleet. The pressure could have crushed anyone else, but not Kaleb, not today. Fire, he ordered. The Valiant shuddered again as its weapons systems powered up, and in the distance flashes of brilliant light erupted across the stars. A dazzling array of energy bolts sliced through the black void, cutting into the Von ships with surgical precision. The first wave of fire didn't last long. Human ingenuity made sure of that. It was a clean strike, fast and efficient. Another wave coming in, Daria warned. This isn't just a skirmish anymore. They're sending in more capital ships. Then we'll hit them hard and fast. No mercy. Kaleb's words were hard, like the impact of a hammer striking metal. He wasn't here for diplomacy or peace talks. The Von Empire had crossed a line, and humanity wasn't going to back down. Captain, Talbot called again, his tone shifting slightly. We're detecting a strange energy signature, sir. It's not typical of their fleet's movement. It could be a trap. Kaleb paused, considering the implications. The Von were cunning. They wouldn't make this easy. He turned back to Talbot, narrowing his eyes. What kind of trap? Their ships are aligning in a way that suggests a coordinated ambush. If we don't adjust, we could be boxed in before reinforcements arrive. Kaleb's lips pressed into a thin line. It was too early for a full-on engagement. They needed to disrupt the Von's formation before they could capitalize on any advantages. His eyes flicked over the tactical map, every instinct telling him to counter with precision. Set course for a vector 5 degrees starboard, Kaleb ordered. We'll move around them, draw them into the blind spot. The crew responded instantly, executing the shift with synchronized efficiency. Kaleb could feel the ship's engines vibrate beneath his feet, their power surging as the Valiant made its calculated maneuver. Space, so vast and silent, seemed to shrink around them. The tension was unbearable. Every crew member was on edge, aware that this moment could decide the fate of their mission. And Kaleb knew that if they faltered, if they showed even the smallest sign of weakness, the Vaughn would descend like a swarm of vultures. "Captain," Daria spoke, her voice steady despite the rising stakes, "we're within range of their capital fleet. We can't afford to waste time now." He turned back to her, nodding once. "Fire again, and hit them harder this time." The ship's cannons answered with a deafening roar, the light from the blasts washing over the dark expanse of space. The battle had only just begun, and already Kaleb could feel the weight of what lay ahead. Each explosion, each attack, was a step towards something much larger than any one battle. "Another transmission, sir," Talbot interrupted, his voice tense. "It's from the Vaughn Empire, a direct challenge." Kaleb braced himself, knowing the nature of this next phase. They were about to be tested in ways they had never imagined. "Put it through," he ordered. The screen flickered, and an image of the Vaughn fleet commander appeared, a towering alien figure with sharp angles and cold, calculating eyes. His voice was deep, filled with unspoken menace. "Humanity's arrogance will be its downfall. Surrender now, or face the wrath of the Vaughn." Kaleb's response was immediate and unyielding. "We'll decide our fate, Vaughn, not you." He cut the transmission, his mind already racing toward the next move. This was it, the beginning of a war that would test everything. Not just the ships, not just the weapons, but their very resolve. Kaleb felt the tension in his chest, but it wasn't fear. It was something more, something primal. The surge of adrenaline, the clarity that came with battle. The Vaughn had underestimated humanity, and they would regret it. "Prepare for Phase 2, Kaleb commanded, his voice ironclad. "Let's show them what it means to challenge us." The Valiant shifted through the cold, endless void, its hull a silent testament to humanity's ambition. The battle was just beginning, but Kaleb could already feel the weight of what lay ahead. The Vaughn had thrown the first punch, but it wouldn't be the last. His eyes, hardened by years of combat, flicked over the tactical display, every flicker of data painting a clearer picture. The stakes had been set. The Vaughn Empire would either kneel or be crushed beneath humanity's will. And Kaleb wasn't about to let them win. "Captain, enemy forces are regrouping," Daria said, her voice steady, but the tension was impossible to ignore. She stood at her station, her eyes scanning the incoming data as it flowed across the screens. "They've got more than we anticipated. A much larger force is en route." Kaleb's fingers flexed into a fist. The Vaughn weren't playing games anymore. They'd sent scouts, but now they were sending their true strength. A fleet the size of a small empire, ready to wipe humanity off the map. "Change of plans," Kaleb ordered, his voice as cold as the vacuum outside. "We're not waiting for them to hit first. Initiate evasive maneuvers and engage at full power. We'll push them back, but we do it on our terms." Daria's gaze snapped to him, her lips pressing into a thin line. "A full assault, Captain? That's not what we discussed. We don't know their full strength yet. It could be a trap." "Then let's make sure they regret it," Kaleb shot back. His eyes bore into the view screen where the Vaughn fleet loomed, a growing mass of metal and hatred. The stars seemed to flicker, as if even they were afraid of what was about to happen. "We're not waiting for them to box us in. We take the fight to them." Daria hesitated for only a heartbeat, then nodded, her fingers flying over her console. "Aye, Captain. Preparing to engage." Kaleb turned to face the bridge, his eyes sweeping across his crew. The weight of leadership settled on him once more, the responsibility pressing into his chest like an anchor. They were all looking to him for direction, and he wouldn't falter. He had no choice. The bridge buzzed with the rhythm of preparation as the crew worked seamlessly together, adjusting weapon systems, shields, and coordinates. Each person was part of a larger machine now, and they would either succeed together or fall apart. Kaleb could feel the sweat bead on his forehead, but he didn't let it show. There was no room for fear, no room for doubt. Not now. "Captain, enemy ships closing in fast," Marco Talbot called out from the comm station, his voice tense. Their formation is shifting. Looks like they're planning a coordinated strike. Kaleb's eyes narrowed. The Vaughn were smart, but they weren't invincible. They'd underestimated humanity's resolve. We'll force their hand, set up a decoy formation, draw them into the blind spot. Daria's fingers moved quickly, issuing the command. Kaleb could almost feel the pulse of the ship as it obeyed his order. The Valiant twisted, its engines propelling it into a sharp turn that sent it hurtling toward the enemy. The space ahead was vast, stretching farther than the eye could see, and yet, in that moment, it felt small, too small for the blood that would be spilled. Phase 1 complete, Daria called. Decoys are deployed. Their forces are following. Kaleb didn't wait. Initiate Phase 2. All weapons online. Let's see how they like a taste of their own medicine. The Valiant shook under the force of its cannons firing, the deck vibrating as the ship unleashed hell upon the approaching Vaughn ships. The sky outside erupted in fire as the first wave of enemy ships detonated, their hulks spinning out of control, flames trailing behind them. The vibrations of the ship's systems thrummed through Kaleb's bones, but he remained still, his eyes locked on the growing chaos outside. Captain, their fleet is staggering, but they're regrouping quickly. They're more coordinated than we anticipated, Daria warned. She didn't flinch at the explosion shaking the ship, her gaze always fixed on the task at hand. Kaleb's jaw clenched, his mind working through the next set of moves. The first strike had bought them some time, but he could feel the Vaughn closing in. This wasn't a game of force. This was a game of wits, of maneuvering, and humanity had one key advantage: unpredictability. Recalibrate weapons, he ordered. We need to blind their command ship. Aim for the central vessel. Firing now, Marco confirmed. The Valiant's cannons fired again, the barrage aimed at the Vaughn flagship. A streak of bright white light cut through the darkness, an arc of destruction. The enemy flagship shuddered, its shields flickering as the blast tore through their defenses. The hull of the ship groaned, its armor buckling under the assault. But the Vaughn were relentless. The flagship was still alive, and it was pulling its forces back into formation. They're regrouping, Daria said, her voice tight. They're setting up a counterstrike. They're bringing in reinforcements. Kaleb's grip on the armrest tightened, his knuckles white. It was happening faster than they could prepare for. But there was one thing the Vaughn didn't know. Humanity thrived under pressure. Evasive maneuvers, Kaleb snapped. We're not waiting to be cornered. Move now! The ship jerked as it veered to the side, a sharp turn that sent it darting into the darkness. The Vaughn followed just as Kaleb had planned. The decoys worked. They had lured the enemy into a space where they were vulnerable. Now it was time for the final blow. Deploy secondary weapons, Kaleb barked. All batteries, hit them now! The Valiant fired again, this time with a full barrage that illuminated the sky. The Vaughn fleet flinched, not expecting the sudden strike. Their formation shattered, their ships scattered in all directions. Kaleb didn't let up. His fingers flew over the console, issuing commands as he watched the devastation unfold. Captain, they're pulling back, Marco said, his voice tinged with disbelief. It's working. They're retreating. For a moment, Kaleb's chest rose and fell with the force of his breath, but he didn't allow himself the luxury of relief. Not yet. They had won the first round, but the battle was far from over. The Vaughn Empire was ruthless, and their retaliation would come soon. Stay alert. They'll regroup, and when they do, we'll be ready. As the Valiant drifted through the remnants of the enemy fleet, Kaleb's mind raced. The war had begun, but this was only the first test. The Vaughn were strong, but humanity had something they couldn't calculate: the heart to fight back, no matter the odds. Captain, Daria spoke again, her voice steady despite the chaos. We've received another transmission from the Vaughn. It's different this time. Kaleb looked up. What do they want now? Daria glanced at the screen. They're offering a ceasefire, a treaty. Kaleb's lip curled into a bitter smile. Don't believe it? It's just another trick. He turned away from the screen, his mind already calculating the next move. The Vaughn had been caught off guard, but they wouldn't make the same mistake twice. and neither would humanity. The storm had only begun to gather. The bridge of the Valiant hummed with tension, the only sounds the steady tapping of fingers on consoles and the occasional murmur of communication between officers. Kaleb Jarn stood at the helm, his hands clasped behind him, staring at the viewport as if the stars could provide answers. The Vaughn Empire had made its first move, and now it was time to return the favor. Humanity's fleet had struck, but the battle was far from over. The enemy was regrouping, and they would not stop until humanity was broken. "Captain, enemy reinforcements are closing in," Daria Graves reported, her voice tight, her eyes scanning the incoming data. "We've already sent out scouts, but there's no telling how many more ships they have hidden out there." Kaleb didn't flinch. "Keep pushing forward," he ordered, his voice like steel. "We're going to make them regret thinking we're just a handful of ships. Full speed ahead." The vibrations beneath his feet intensified as the ship surged forward, its weapons primed and ready. Kaleb knew it wouldn't be an easy fight, but they had come too far to retreat now. His fingers itched to give the order, but they needed precision. They needed strategy. "Lieutenant Talbot, send out the first strike," Kaleb barked, his eyes never leaving the view of the enemy formation. It was starting to take shape, like a dark cloud, ready to burst. Talbot's voice cut through the air. "Aye, Captain. Initiating fire." The first barrage erupted from the Valiant, the massive weapons shaking the hull as they released a torrent of destructive energy. The space outside erupted in blinding light as the enemy ships took the full brunt of the attack. There was no time for celebration, only for calculation. Kaleb's gaze was fixed on the tactical display, watching as the Vaughn fleet scattered, forced to regroup. "Captain!" Daria's voice was sharper now. "They're splitting their fleet. We're going to be facing them on multiple fronts." "Let them split," Kaleb replied, his tone flat. "We'll hit them in the chaos. They won't know what hit them." His mind worked quickly, mapping out the enemy's likely strategies, predicting their every move. He wasn't just a commander of ships. He was a strategist, and the battlefield was his to shape. The Vaughn had underestimated humanity, and Kaleb wasn't about to let them recover. "Reposition the fleet," Kaleb ordered. "Create a crossfire formation. We'll push them into a corner. When we have them, we'll strike hard." Daria glanced at him, her face a picture of focused concentration. "Aye, Captain. Adjusting fleet trajectory." The ship rocked under the pressure of its own speed, and Kaleb's jaw tightened. He had seen battles like this before. Strikes made in desperation, with everything on the line. There was no turning back. They were in the eye of the storm, and it was only going to get worse. The Vaughn didn't take long to react. Their fleet, despite its size, was nimble, each ship capable of swift maneuvering, cutting across the stars like predators in the night. But Kaleb had already predicted this. He had already accounted for their speed. He had prepared for this. "Captain," Talbot called again, his voice now laced with urgency. "There's something unusual about their next move. I can't make sense of it. It's like they're waiting for something." Kaleb's gaze flicked to the screen. The Vaughn fleet, despite being scattered, was holding its ground. The ships weren't retreating. They were moving in a way that suggested they were preparing to trap humanity, to draw them into a fight they couldn't win. "Hold steady," Kaleb said, his voice unwavering. "They're trying to bait us. They want us to charge forward." Daria's eyes widened. "But if we fall for it—" "If we fall for it," Kaleb cut her off, "then we lose. Keep the formation. No one moves until I say so." The seconds stretched into eternity as the two forces locked eyes across the stars. The Vaughn fleet was closing in, but they had made one fatal mistake. They had underestimated Kaleb's patience. He had learned long ago that in war, timing was everything. The silence on the bridge was deafening. The crew waited for Kaleb's command, their eyes fixed on him, on the final decision that would change everything. His fingers tightened around the edge of his console, his thoughts spinning through the endless possibilities. "Now," Kaleb whispered, though the word was more like a command to himself than to anyone else. "Fire!" he shouted. The Valiant unleashed everything it had, lasers, missiles, and kinetic strikes, all firing simultaneously. The force of it shook the ship, but Kaleb barely noticed. His focus was entirely on the enemy fleet, which had been lured into the crossfire. The Von ships didn't have time to regroup. They were overwhelmed in a matter of seconds, their formations shattered by the precise and brutal strike. But Kaleb knew that this was only the beginning. This battle wasn't going to end in one strike. "Captain!" Daria called, her voice filled with disbelief. They're falling back. I think we've broken their front." Kaleb allowed himself a moment's satisfaction before his mind refocused. "They're not done. They'll regroup, prepare for their next move." The bridge buzzed with activity as the crew scrambled to adjust to the sudden shift in the battle. But Kaleb's mind was already racing. He knew how the Von operated. He had seen this before. They would lick their wounds, regroup, and come back stronger. The real fight was just beginning. "Report!" Kaleb barked, his eyes scanning the data that flooded the screen. "Enemy ships are retreating to an unknown position," Talbot replied, his voice now tinged with confusion. "We're picking up strange energy readings. It's something we haven't seen before." Daria's brow furrowed. "Could it be another trap?" "More than likely," Kaleb replied. "But it's not a trap we can't handle. We move in, full force. We'll bring the fight to them before they can build any more surprises." The crew's fingers moved quickly across consoles, preparing for the next phase. Kaleb's mind raced, each calculation more urgent than the last. But amidst the rising tension, something gnawed at him. The Von's retreat wasn't just a tactical move. It was something else, a warning. "Captain," Daria said, her voice low, almost hesitant, "I don't like this. There's something about this situation that doesn't add up." Kaleb's eyes narrowed. He had felt it too. "We won't wait for them to dictate the terms of this battle. We move now." But as the Valiant moved toward the Von's last known position, Kaleb couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The enemy had fallen back, but for what? There was no sense in retreating unless they had something to hide. As they neared the coordinates, the crew tensed, ready for whatever the Von had waiting. Kaleb couldn't shake the feeling that this was just another layer of their plan, a plan that would soon reveal itself in a way they hadn't anticipated. "We're almost there," Daria said quietly. Kaleb's eyes stayed fixed ahead, but his thoughts were elsewhere, caught in the swirling chaos of the universe. Something dark was lurking just beyond their reach, and soon they would find it. He didn't know what it was yet, but he could feel it in his gut. The Von weren't done with humanity. They were just getting started. And what came next would change everything. The Valiant surged through the stars, its weapon systems primed, its crew bracing for the unknown. Kaleb's fingers gripped the edge of his command console, his knuckles white as he stared out into the abyss. The enemy was close, too close for comfort. The tension on the bridge was suffocating, a taut wire ready to snap. His mind raced, each thought a calculated step toward the next phase of the fight. The Von had retreated, regrouping in the darkness, waiting to spring a trap. Kaleb could feel the shifting weight of their absence, like the calm before a storm that held a promise of destruction. His gut told him they were preparing something that would change the tide of this war. "Captain!" Daria Graves's voice sliced through the silence, her tone sharp. "We've reached their last known position. No sign of them yet, but the energy readings are off the charts. Something's hiding out there." Kaleb's brow furrowed. "I knew it. They're setting up something. Stay alert. We're not walking into another ambush." The crew worked in synchronized harmony, their movements fluid, yet tense. The bridge was lit only by the cold, harsh light of the tactical displays, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and reach across the metal walls. Kaleb's eyes scanned the data that appeared, a matrix of coordinates and flickering alerts, each one adding a layer of doubt to his certainty. Something was wrong, and it wasn't just the Von's absence. It was too quiet, too deliberate. "We should have found them by now," Talbot said, his voice tight with frustration. "No ships, no sign of life. Only the readings. It's like they've disappeared." "Or they're waiting for us to make a mistake," Kaleb muttered under his breath. "Daria, give me a full tactical scan. I want every possible angle covered." The lieutenant nodded, her hands moving swiftly over the controls. The air felt dense, almost suffocating as the ship slowly glided toward the coordinates. Kaleb could feel his pulse quicken, the anticipation tightening in his chest. Every instinct told him that the Vaughn were out there, lurking just beyond their reach. "Captain," Daria's voice broke through the mounting tension, "I'm picking up a faint signal. It's weak, almost like a shadow in the data, but it's coming from a new location, some kind of anomaly. It could be a trap." "Of course it is," Kaleb said, his eyes narrowing. "Alter course. Set a direct path to the anomaly. If they think we'll fall for their tricks, they're wrong." The ship's course shifted, the cold, dark void around them filling with the subtle movement of the Valiant as it adjusted its trajectory. The crew remained tight-lipped, their focus unwavering. Kaleb's thoughts churned, his mind sifting through the possibilities. He could feel it now, the tightness in the air, the barely perceptible shift in the ship's velocity. The Vaughn were playing a dangerous game, but he was ready. He had to be. A soft, distant vibration shuddered through the ship, though no one spoke of it. It was a ripple in the fabric of the Valiant, a reminder of how vulnerable they all were in the face of unknown enemies. Kaleb glanced at Daria, her profile lit by the green glow of her console. She was tense, but there was a quiet determination in her eyes that mirrored his own. "Everything's in place, Captain," she said, her voice measured. "We should be entering the anomaly's radius in 3 minutes." Kaleb nodded, his gaze fixed ahead. His grip on the armrest tightened as they approached the anomaly's signal. The air around him felt heavier now, thick with the weight of the unknown. What awaited them out there? What was the Vaughn Empire hiding? His mind raced through possibilities, each one darker than the last. "Captain," Marco's voice was strained, "I'm detecting a sudden spike in energy output from the anomaly. It's growing exponentially. I can't pinpoint the source." "Increase speed," Kaleb ordered. "We're going in." The ship lurched slightly as its engines kicked into overdrive, surging forward with a newfound urgency. Kaleb's eyes never left the data streaming across the tactical display, each new number another piece of the puzzle falling into place. The tension on the bridge was palpable. His ears rang with the rush of adrenaline, every movement now urgent, filled with the expectation of what might come next. "Captain," Daria said sharply, her eyes flicking to the readings. "Something's coming. We're not alone out here anymore." Before Kaleb could respond, the Valiant rocked violently, throwing everyone forward. The bridge shuddered with the impact, alarms blaring. The stars outside the viewport shifted, and in that instant, a massive ship, almost ghostly in appearance, emerged from the anomaly, cloaked in shimmering, pulsating energy. Its dark silhouette was jagged, its hull a maze of sharp edges and glowing cracks, like the very void itself had birthed it. "Incoming!" Marco shouted, his voice a mixture of awe and panic. Kaleb's breath caught in his throat, but his voice remained steady. "Return fire! Full barrage! Now!" The Valiant's guns roared to life, their brilliant flashes of light tearing through the vast emptiness. The enemy ship's shields flared, rippling with the impact, but it held. Kaleb's mind raced as the battle began to unfold. This wasn't just a fight. This was a message, a challenge, and it was clear that the Vaughn had something far more dangerous than they had anticipated. "Captain, there's more," Daria said, her voice low. "More ships, smaller ones, but they're coming in fast." Kaleb's eyes flicked to the scanners. Hundreds of smaller Vaughn vessels, darting through space like deadly wasps, were swarming toward them. Each one was an enemy, each one a potential death sentence if they weren't dealt with swiftly. "Focus on the larger ship first. We take out the leader," Kaleb ordered. "Then we deal with the swarm." The Valiant fired again, its powerful guns lighting up the darkness of space as they hammered the Vaughn flagship. But even as the energy bolt struck, the enemy ship's hull seemed to absorb the force, its shields pulsing with a dark, ominous energy. Kaleb clenched his jaw. The Vaughn weren't just fighting for survival. They were preparing for something bigger. "Lieutenant Graves, adjust fire, aim for their weapon systems. We need to disable them before they can retaliate." Daria moved with practiced precision, her fingers dancing across the console as the ship's weapons recalibrated. Kaleb could feel the weight of every decision pressing down on him. His crew was relying on him, the fleet was relying on him, and humanity was on the brink of something far more catastrophic than anyone had imagined. A blast from the enemy ship struck the Valiant's hull, sending a shudder through the bridge. The shields flickered, then surged back to full strength. But Kaleb could see the damage reports streaming in. It wasn't just the ship they were damaging, it was the future. "Captain," Marco said, his voice clipped, "they've activated some sort of energy pulse. It's scrambling our systems. We can't keep track of their movements." Kaleb's heart rate quickened, but his voice remained firm. "Prepare for close combat. We fight in the shadows. They won't see us coming." Outside, the space around the Valiant was filled with the chaos of battle, but Kaleb's mind was clear. This was only the beginning, and the questions now far outweighed the answers. The Vaughn had revealed a new weapon, something far beyond what they had expected. But what was it? What kind of force had the power to twist the laws of physics and bend them to their will? The pulse of battle raged around him, but Kaleb knew one thing for certain. This was only the first step in a much darker game, and the pieces were just starting to move. The Valiant surged forward, its trajectory now set toward the heart of the chaos. The bridge was a battlefield in its own right, alive with the urgent hum of commands and frantic calculations. Kaleb Jarn's jaw was tight, his fingers flexing against the cold console, but he couldn't afford to think about the rising tension. The larger enemy ship, the one they'd been hammering for hours, had finally flinched. Its energy shields flickered, cracks forming across the dark surface, but it wasn't enough. The Vaughn ship still moved with terrifying precision, still coordinated with its smaller counterparts that darted around them like fireflies in the night. "Captain, their flagship is showing signs of strain," Daria called from her station, her voice sharp. "We've damaged the primary weapons array. The secondary shields are weakening." Kaleb nodded, his mind calculating the next series of moves. "Good. Keep the pressure on. No let-up. But I want us prepared for something different. They're hiding something. Something we haven't seen yet." The bridge crew worked without hesitation, commands flowing like a well-oiled machine. Yet, despite the urgency, a cold unease settled in the pit of Kaleb's stomach. The larger enemy vessel was slowing, not retreating, but shifting positions, aligning itself in a new formation, one that felt deliberate. "Captain, we've got a new energy surge from the flagship." Marco Talbot's voice broke through the tension, laced with concern. "It's unlike anything we've encountered. Power levels are beyond what their ship should be capable of." Kaleb's mind raced as he studied the readings on the screen. "Reinforcements or something else?" "Hard to tell, sir. It's almost as if they've tapped into something." Marco's voice faltered. "Something not of this galaxy." The Valiant's hull vibrated as the bridge crew held their collective breath. The shift in the air felt palpable, like a moment before a thunderstorm. Kaleb's eyes remained locked on the tactical display, but his mind was elsewhere. He had spent years preparing for battles like this, expecting the worst. But the Valiant was humanity's best hope, and it was slowly being tested beyond its limits. "Enemy ships are breaking formation," Daria said, urgency creeping into her voice. "They're folding space around themselves. It's not a jump, more like they're bending reality." Kaleb's eyes snapped to her, feeling a cold sweat slip down his back. "What do you mean, a bending reality?" She paused, her fingers flying over the console. "I can't explain it, sir, but there's a distortion. As if the laws of physics are—" She cut herself off, frustration evident. The energy field around them is warping like it's not just a ship anymore. Kaleb's instincts kicked in, a primal understanding that something far beyond his comprehension was unfolding. This wasn't just a war for survival anymore. The Vaughn had shown their true hand, and what lay beneath the surface was far more dangerous than they could have imagined. "Prepare for immediate evasive maneuvers," Kaleb ordered, his voice as steady as steel. "If they can alter space itself, we need to stay one step ahead." He turned to the display once more, watching the Vaughn fleet, now twisting and warping in unpredictable patterns. Ships that had once been predictable now disappeared from the scanners, only to reappear moments later in new locations. The battlefield had transformed into a tangled mess of anomalies and unknown forces. Each pulse from the enemy ship sent ripples through the fabric of space, bending it, warping it, as if they were trying to rewrite the very rules of combat. "Captain, they're coming back online," Daria said, her voice laced with a note of disbelief. "The flagship. It's not just a ship anymore, it's turning into—" A violent shake rattled the entire ship. Kaleb's grip on the console tightened, his breath sharp as the vibrations ran through him like a shock wave. "Report!" he barked. "We're losing shields," Talbot yelled. "The distortion. They're warping our systems. They've broken through." The crew scrambled in panic as alarms blared, the Valiant's hull groaning under the strain. Kaleb's heart pounded in his chest as his mind raced for a solution. The Vaughn had discovered something, some force, some weapon that bent reality itself, and they were using it to tear through the very essence of space. "Daria, isolate the central anomaly," Kaleb said, his voice calm despite the chaos. "I want every resource focused on finding that energy source. Now." Daria's hands danced over her console, her focus unwavering despite the mounting pressure. "Tracking it now, Captain," she said after a long pause. "There's something within the anomaly. It's shifting, almost like it's alive." Kaleb's breath hitched as he leaned forward. This wasn't just a war between fleets. The Vaughn weren't just fighting for dominance. They were experimenting with something far older, far more dangerous, something that could change the course of history. "Get a fix on it," Kaleb commanded, his mind working faster than his body could keep up. He could feel the sweat trickling down his brow. But he wasn't about to show weakness now. The enemy's tricks weren't enough to break him. Not yet. The seconds dragged on, each one more excruciating than the last. Kaleb could feel the eyes of his crew on him, waiting for direction, waiting for him to lead them through the storm. The Vaughn flagship was now fully engulfed in its energy distortion, pulsing with an almost hypnotic rhythm. The ships around it continued to flicker in and out of existence, some vanishing entirely, before reappearing in places they had no right to be. "Captain," Daria said again, her voice steady, but now tinged with something she hadn't shown before, fear. It's trying to pull us in. The anomaly. It's not just distorting space. It's pulling us towards it. Our systems are going offline." Kaleb felt the sickening lurch in his stomach, a sensation that had nothing to do with the ship's movement. "Divert all power to the emergency systems," he said, his voice cutting through the panic that had begun to creep into the crew. "We're not falling into that thing, not while we still have breath in our lungs." The battle was no longer about fighting the Vaughn. It was about surviving this unknown force that had awakened, and Kaleb could feel its pull deep within his bones. The crew scrambled, but Kaleb's mind never wavered. They were caught in something much bigger than a war, something that could change the very fabric of their existence. "Captain, we can't break free," Daria's voice cracked under the pressure. "It's pulling us in. The distortion is too strong." Kaleb's gaze locked onto the screen, his thoughts moving faster than his words. "We're not going down without a fight. Brace for impact. Prepare for the unknown." In that moment, as the Valiant lurched forward, Kaleb could sense something shifting. The reality around them was warping, twisting. There was no escape now. The galaxy wasn't just at war, it was bending and fracturing, and soon they would find out what awaited them on the other side. The Valiant shuddered, the deck vibrating with a violence that sent tremors through Kaleb's body. His hands gripped the edge of the console, his knuckles pale against the cold steel. Outside, the stars had begun to warp, twisting and bending as if reality itself was being pulled into a black hole. The anomaly, whatever it was, had them in its grasp now, and the Valiant felt small, fragile, like a leaf caught in a storm. "Captain," Daria's voice broke through the chaos, trembling but determined. "We've lost all contact with the fleet. Our systems are being overridden. I can't keep track of anything." Kaleb's heart beat faster. The lights flickered, dimming and brightening with an unsettling rhythm. There was no time for panic, no time for hesitation. If they didn't break free now, they wouldn't get out at all. "Override the systems manually," Kaleb snapped, his voice low, steady. "Push through it. We have to regain control." His words cut through the air, but the force of the anomaly seemed to press down on them from all sides, a tangible weight suffocating the crew. Kaleb could taste the metal in the air, a sharp tang that left his mouth dry. His thoughts raced, each one tumbling into the next, searching for a solution. "Captain?" Marco's voice was strained, filled with uncertainty. I think we're in a pocket. No, a rift or some kind of—" He paused, the words catching in his throat. "I can't explain it. The stars are gone. It's like they never existed." Kaleb stood, unmoving. His thoughts swirled with the possibilities, but no strategy, no training could have prepared them for this. "Daria," he said, turning toward her, his voice sharper, "tell me exactly what's happening out there." She glanced at him, her face illuminated by the flickering console, her features tight with effort. "The energy pulses are so intense, they're distorting our trajectory. We're being pulled in multiple directions. I can't track the anomaly anymore. It's like it's shifting. It doesn't have a fixed location anymore. It's—" She stopped, swallowing hard. "It's changing the way space behaves." Kaleb's chest tightened. He had heard of things like this before, legends, myths about beings that could manipulate the fabric of reality, the very laws that governed the universe. But never in his wildest dreams had he imagined that humanity would face something so alien. The ship's shaking grew worse, the vibration turning into a violent rattle that sent sparks flying from exposed wires. The crew ducked instinctively as the ship's bulkheads groaned in protest. It felt as if the Valiant was caught in the grasp of a force too ancient to comprehend, a force beyond the realm of their understanding. The battle was no longer about fighting the Vaughn. It was about surviving this unknown force that had awakened, and Kaleb could feel its pull deep within his bones. The crew scrambled, but Kaleb's mind never wavered. They were caught in something much bigger than a war, something that could change the very fabric of their existence. "Captain, we can't break free!" Daria's voice cracked under the pressure. "It's pulling us in. The distortion is too strong." Kaleb's gaze locked onto the screen, his thoughts moving faster than his words. "We're not going down without a fight. Brace for impact. Prepare for the unknown." In that moment, as the Valiant lurched forward, Kaleb could sense something shifting. The reality around them was warping, twisting. There was no escape now. The galaxy wasn't just at war, it was bending and fracturing, and soon they would find out what awaited them on the other side. The Valiant shuddered, the deck vibrating with a violence that sent tremors through Kaleb's body. His hands gripped the edge of the console, his knuckles pale against the cold steel. Outside, the stars had begun to warp, twisting and bending as if reality itself was being pulled into a black hole. The anomaly, whatever it was, had them in its grasp now, and the Valiant felt small, fragile, like a leaf caught in a storm. "Captain," Daria's voice broke through the chaos, trembling but determined. "We've lost all contact with the fleet. Our systems are being overridden. I can't keep track of anything." Kaleb's heart beat faster. The lights flickered, dimming and brightening with an unsettling rhythm. There was no time for panic, no time for hesitation. If they didn't break free now, they wouldn't get out at all. "Override the systems manually," Kaleb snapped, his voice low, steady. "Push through it. We have to regain control." His words cut through the air, but the force of the anomaly seemed to press down on them from all sides, a tangible weight suffocating the crew. Kaleb could taste the metal in the air, a sharp tang that left his mouth dry. His thoughts raced, each one tumbling into the next, searching for a solution. "Captain?" Marco's voice was strained, filled with uncertainty. I think we're in a pocket. No, a rift or some kind of—" He paused, the words catching in his throat. "I can't explain it. The stars are gone. It's like they never existed." Kaleb stood, unmoving. His thoughts swirled with the possibilities, but no strategy, no training could have prepared them for this. "Daria," he said, turning toward her, his voice sharper, Tell me exactly what's happening out there." She glanced at him, her face illuminated by the flickering console, her features tight with effort. "The energy pulses are so intense, they're distorting our trajectory. We're being pulled in multiple directions. I can't track the anomaly anymore. It's like it's shifting. It doesn't have a fixed location anymore. It's—" She stopped, swallowing hard. "It's changing the way space behaves." Kaleb's chest tightened. He had heard of things like this before. Legends, myths about beings that could manipulate the fabric of reality, the very laws that governed the universe. But never in his wildest dreams had he imagined that humanity would face something so alien. The ship's shaking grew worse, the vibration turning into a violent rattle that sent sparks flying from exposed wires. The crew ducked instinctively as the ship's bulkheads groaned in protest. It felt as if the Valiant was caught in the grasp of a force too ancient to comprehend, a force beyond the realm of their understanding. "Shields are down to 20%. Daria's voice came again, strained. "We can't take much more of this, Captain." Kaleb's pulse quickened, his thoughts a blur of calculations. The fleet was no longer in sight, lost to the madness of whatever force the Vaughn had unleashed. His crew, their trust in him absolute, was hanging by a thread. He needed to act. He needed to get them out of this before it consumed them completely. "Captain, something's approaching," Marco said, his voice a whisper of dread. "I can't see it clearly. It's moving faster than we can react. We're being surrounded by something." The Valiant's hull shuddered again, and this time Kaleb could hear it, a deep, resonating thrum, as if the fabric of the ship itself was trembling in fear. He turned toward the viewport, his eyes narrowing. Nothing. Space had turned pitch black. The stars vanished into an inky void. It was as if they had entered a different dimension, one that defied logic. And yet, despite the emptiness, Kaleb felt eyes upon them. He wasn't sure how he knew it, but the sensation crawled up his spine like a phantom, cold and unavoidable. "Report!" Kaleb barked, his voice firm, even though the gnawing unease in his gut threatened to break through. "The energy readings are fluctuating," Daria said, her voice low. "But this is not a ship, Captain. It's something else." Kaleb's throat tightened, his mind racing through the impossible. Whatever was closing in on them wasn't bound by the same rules as anything they'd encountered before. The Vaughn's technology, their warships, none of it mattered now. They were trapped in a place beyond the edges of known space. And whatever was coming, it wasn't friendly. "Brace for impact," Kaleb ordered, his voice laced with an edge of urgency. The crew complied without hesitation, locking into their stations, securing themselves for whatever might come. And then it happened. A flash of darkness. No, not darkness, but something far worse. The stars in the void flickered, their glow wavering like a fading dream, and in their place, something else emerged. It was vast, incomprehensible, an entity of pure energy and dark matter, swirling like a black hole that had broken free from the universe's constraints. It surged toward them with an intensity that made Kaleb's chest tighten, his breath catching in his throat. "Captain!" Daria shouted, her voice breaking through the sound of the ship's screeching hull. "It's pulling us in. I can't stop it." Kaleb gritted his teeth, forcing himself to think, to focus. The ship was fighting back, its systems screaming in protest, but it was useless against the pull of the entity. The laws of physics were bending, crumbling under the weight of this unimaginable force. Kaleb could feel the very air around him warping, his thoughts growing sluggish as though the very concept of time itself was being stretched and snapped. "Hold on!" Kaleb shouted, even though he wasn't sure if anyone could hear him. He gripped the armrest tighter, the skin of his palms stinging as his pulse raced. The lights flickered again, but this time they didn't come back on. The bridge was plunged into darkness, the only illumination the pale, sickly glow from the viewport as the entity closed in. And then the silence hit. It was as if the ship, no, the entire galaxy, had gone still. The hum of the Valiant systems had ceased, replaced by an eerie quiet that was deafening. Kaleb couldn't even hear his own breath. The sensation was suffocating, unnerving. Daria. Kaleb's voice was barely a whisper. "What the hell is this?" She didn't answer. No one did. Instead, there was a sudden weight, a pressure pushing down on them from all sides. Kaleb felt it in his chest, the air thickening, as though the universe itself had folded around them, trapping them in a pocket of chaos. Then, as if the universe had blinked, everything shifted. The pressure was gone. The distortion collapsed into nothingness, leaving behind a vast, incomprehensible emptiness. Kaleb's head spun. The bridge lights flickered back on, but they were dim, flickering like the last remnants of a fading flame. Kaleb blinked hard, trying to clear the haze in his mind, trying to understand what had just happened. But as he looked out into the black void of space, he knew one thing for certain. The Vaughn had opened something they couldn't control, and now the universe itself had been changed. Someone had been waiting for them. And Kaleb had a sinking feeling that this was only the beginning of a far greater conflict than anyone had ever imagined. "We've only just scratched the surface," he whispered, his heart heavy with the weight of what lay ahead. The unknown loomed before them, and Kaleb had no idea what they would find in the dark. The Valiant floated, still as a stone, suspended in a void that felt both infinite and oppressive. The anomaly that had nearly consumed them lay just beyond their reach, an incomprehensible force pulsing in the dark. Kaleb Jarn stood motionless, his eyes locked on the empty space outside the viewport. His thoughts raced, but his body felt strangely detached, as though the universe had shifted beneath his feet. "What the hell was that?" Daria's voice cut through the silence, her tone a mix of awe and terror. She was standing beside him now, her face pale under the harsh bridge lights, the glow of the consoles reflecting in her eyes. "I don't know," Kaleb admitted, his voice strained. "But we're not going to wait around for it to decide what it wants." The crew worked quietly around him, the usual flurry of activity now reduced to an eerie calm. The Valiant had stopped moving entirely, and the once clear stars now hung in the dark sky like distant pinpricks of light, obscured by the strange gravitational distortions that surrounded them. Kaleb's instincts screamed that they were in the presence of something far more dangerous than the Vaughn, something that had no place in the universe they knew. "Daria," Kaleb said, his gaze never leaving the viewport, "I want you to run another scan. Check for any energy signatures, anything at all that could give us an edge. We need to know what we're dealing with before we make a move." She nodded, her fingers already dancing over the console, but Kaleb could see the hesitation in her movements. The uncertainty weighed heavily on them all. They had never been this far out before, never this deep into the unknown. "There's nothing," Daria said after a long pause. "At least, nothing we can identify. It's like the space around us is being actively suppressed. The readings we're getting are inconsistent, almost like we're in two places at once." Kaleb turned to face her, his mind already piecing together the fragments of their situation. "That distortion we saw, what if it wasn't just a wave or some strange anomaly? What if it's a kind of weapon, or something far worse?" "I thought it might be a Vaughn weapon," Daria replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "But this is something different. The Vaughn don't have anything like this." "I agree," Kaleb said, a chill creeping into his chest. "But we've been given a chance here. They pulled us into this. They wanted us to face this. Whatever it is, it's not just a threat to humanity. It's a threat to everything." The crew shifted uneasily, the weight of his words sinking in. Kaleb's gaze swept over them, each face etched with the same unspoken question. What now? They had barely survived the initial shock, and now they faced an enemy whose power and motives remained an enigma. But one thing was clear. If they didn't regain control, they wouldn't be around to find out. "All right," Kaleb said, his voice steady now. "We've got one shot at this. We can't sit here and wait for it to come back. We need to break free of this rift and get back to the fleet. I want a course plotted back to the nearest point where we can regroup. Full power, shields up. We don't know what's waiting out there." Marco Talbot, who had been monitoring the scanners, nodded. "Course plotted, Captain. But if we're going to make it out of this, we'll need to evade the gravitational disturbances. The rift's gravitational field is still affecting us. If we're not careful, we'll be pulled back into it. Kaleb glanced at the tactical map on the screen. His fingers twitched with the knowledge of what needed to be done. They weren't just going to break free from the distortion. They were going to force their way out. With no clear idea of what lay beyond the rift, their chances of survival hinged on one thing: speed. "Daria," Kaleb said, his voice cutting through the tension. "Once we're clear of the anomaly, I want every weapon system on standby. We don't know what we'll be facing when we break free." Daria met his gaze, her eyes intense. "Understood, Captain." Kaleb turned to Marco. "Talbot, you and your team will take the helm. I want evasive maneuvers prepared for any sudden shifts. We can't afford to be caught off guard again." Marco nodded, his brow furrowed in concentration as his fingers flew over the console, inputting coordinates and adjusting the ship's course. The crew had grown quiet, each person immersed in their tasks, but Kaleb knew they were all thinking the same thing. Would they make it out? Would the Valiant survive this? The ship began to move, cautiously at first, as the first tremors of the rift still gripped them. The crew held their breath, waiting for the next shockwave, the next moment of instability. Kaleb's heart thudded in his chest, but his mind was focused, clear. They had to keep moving. They had to get back to the fleet. "Steady," Kaleb muttered under his breath as the ship began to pick up speed, its engines roaring to life with a powerful force that vibrated through his bones. He could feel the acceleration, the ship surging forward, the cold metal walls humming with every new burst of power. For a moment, the ship seemed to escape the worst of the rift's pull, the distortion around them flickering like a dying flame. Kaleb exhaled, feeling the tension lift from his chest, but it wasn't over. Not yet. "Captain," Daria said, her voice low, "something's wrong. The rift's energy, it's reversing. We've been pulled back. The gravitational field's intensity is increasing." Kaleb's pulse spiked as the ship rocked violently. They hadn't escaped yet. The rift wasn't letting them go. "Cut all non-essential power," Kaleb barked. "Do whatever it takes to break free. Now." The crew worked in frantic silence, their movements a blur of desperation. Kaleb felt it. The ship's systems, already stretched to their limits, were beginning to fail. The lights flickered, the consoles spitting out warnings and errors faster than they could fix them. But the Valiant held together, every piece of technology, every hand holding the line. Outside, the Anomaly pulsed again, sending out shockwaves that rattled the ship. Kaleb's heart pounded in time with the beats of the ship's failing systems. But they were close. They were close. The crew shifted uneasily, the weight of his words sinking in. Kaleb's gaze swept over them, each face etched with the same unspoken question. What now? They had barely survived the initial shock, and now they faced an enemy whose power and motives remained an enigma. But one thing was clear. If they didn't regain control, they wouldn't be around to find out. "All right," Kaleb said, his voice steady now. "We've got one shot at this. We can't sit here and wait for it to come back. We need to break free of this rift and get back to the fleet. I want a course plotted back to the nearest point where we can regroup. Full power, shields up. We don't know what's waiting out there." Marco Talbot, who had been monitoring the scanners, nodded. "Course plotted, Captain. But if we're going to make it out of this, we'll need to evade the gravitational disturbances. The rift's gravitational field is still affecting us. If we're not careful, we'll be pulled back into it." Kaleb glanced at the tactical map on the screen. His fingers twitched with the knowledge of what needed to be done. They weren't just going to break free from the distortion. They were going to force their way out. With no clear idea of what lay beyond the rift, their chances of survival hinged on one thing: speed. "Daria," Kaleb said, his voice cutting through the tension. "Once we're clear of the anomaly, I want every weapon system on standby. We don't know what we'll be facing when we break free." Daria met his gaze, her eyes intense. "Understood, Captain." Kaleb turned to Marco. "Talbot, you and your team will take the helm. I want evasive maneuvers prepared for any sudden shifts. We can't afford to be caught off guard again." Marco nodded, His brow furrowed in concentration as his fingers flew over the console, inputting coordinates and adjusting the ship's course. The crew had grown quiet, each person immersed in their tasks, but Kaleb knew they were all thinking the same thing. Would they make it out? Would the Valiant survive this? The ship began to move, cautiously at first, as the first tremors of the rift still gripped them. The crew held their breath, waiting for the next shockwave, the next moment of instability. Kaleb's heart thudded in his chest, but his mind was focused, clear. They had to keep moving. They had to get back to the fleet. "Steady," Kaleb muttered under his breath as the ship began to pick up speed, its engines roaring to life with a powerful force that vibrated through his bones. He could feel the acceleration, the ship surging forward, the cold metal walls humming with every new burst of power. For a moment, the ship seemed to escape the worst of the rift's pull, the distortion around them flickering like a dying flame. Kaleb exhaled, feeling the tension lift from his chest, but it wasn't over. Not yet. "Captain," Daria said, her voice low, "something's wrong. The rift's energy, it's reversing. We've been pulled back. The gravitational field's intensity is increasing." Kaleb's pulse spiked as the ship rocked violently. They hadn't escaped yet. The rift wasn't letting them go. "Cut all non-essential power," Kaleb barked. "Do whatever it takes to break free. Now." The crew worked in frantic silence, their movements a blur of desperation. Kaleb felt it. The ship's systems, already stretched to their limits, were beginning to fail. The lights flickered, the consoles spitting out warnings and errors faster than they could fix them. But the Valiant held together, every piece of technology, every hand holding the line. Outside, the Anomaly pulsed again, sending out shockwaves that rattled the ship. Kaleb's heart pounded in time with the beats of the ship's failing systems. But they were close. They were close. "Captain, we've cleared the rift's boundaries," Marco announced, his voice strained. "But there's nothing out here. Just darkness." Kaleb's eyes narrowed. He hadn't expected an immediate return to the known, but something about the silence out there felt wrong. He had been prepared for enemy ships, for a counterattack. Instead, they faced an empty, cold void. "Hold your position," Kaleb ordered, his voice steady but his mind already racing. "Something's waiting for us out here. We're not alone." The Valiant drifted, a lone sentinel in a sea of unbroken darkness. Kaleb Jarn stood at the bridge's helm, his hands clenched tightly around the armrest. Silence had descended over them like a shroud. Outside, the stars were distant whispers, pale and cold, as though the universe itself had forgotten them. They had escaped the rift, but what lay beyond the boundary of that incomprehensible force? What waited in the emptiness? The ship was battered, its hull groaning with the strain of surviving the distortion. Systems were still flickering, each wave of energy threatening to tear apart everything they had fought for. Kaleb's gaze remained fixed on the viewport, his thoughts churning as the crew worked in grim silence around him. "Captain, we're receiving a transmission," Daria said, her voice steady but laced with uncertainty. "It's from the Vaughn. No encryption, just an open channel." Kaleb's stomach tightened. This wasn't a diplomatic message. He had a feeling it was a warning. "Patch it through," Kaleb ordered. The screen before him flickered, then settled into a grim silhouette. The voice that emerged was deep, guttural, carrying the weight of centuries of conquest. Kaleb's fists tightened. "You are fools," the voice boomed, reverberating through the ship's speakers. "You have ventured far beyond your understanding. You have defied the natural order. What you call the rift is nothing more than a doorway, a gate to the unknown. The universe you cling to is fragile, and soon you will see its true face." Kaleb's gaze never wavered. "What is it you want, Vaughn?" His voice was sharp, cutting through the taunting tone with the force of steel. "You wanted to break us, to crush humanity. But you failed. You're not going to win." The image on the screen shifted, revealing the face of a Vaughn officer, his eyes cold, calculating. "You misunderstand, Captain. We don't want to win. We want to show you that survival has its price, that power, control, they are fleeting. The truth you've seen is just the beginning. Your existence, The human race, it's nothing but a grain of sand in the ocean of the cosmos, and soon you will learn your place." Kaleb felt a surge of anger rise within him, a flame that burned hotter with every word. He could feel the weight of every battle, every sacrifice weighing down on him. "We've already learned our place," he said, his voice low, his words deliberate. "We don't bow to anyone, not the Vaughn, not the gods. We don't bend, and we don't break. You don't get to dictate our future. We do." There was a long pause before the Vaughn officer spoke again, but this time his voice was colder, almost bitter. "You are deluded. You think you control your fate? The universe doesn't care about your defiance. You are nothing, and when the true enemy arrives, you will fall, just like the others." Kaleb stood taller, a fire igniting within him. "You're right about one thing. We are nothing, but humanity is something you'll never understand. We don't need to control the universe. We don't need to bend it to our will. We just need to survive. And we will. We've been surviving since the dawn of time, through disease, through war, through the very forces of nature. We rise, and no matter what, we always rise." His words echoed through the bridge, the crew now listening in silence. For a moment there was only the soft crackle of the transmission before the Vaughn officer finally spoke, his voice heavy with disbelief. "You speak of survival, but survival alone is meaningless. It is dominance, conquest, that determines worth." Kaleb's gaze never left the screen, his heart beating steady, unwavering. It's the will to keep moving forward that matters. The will to stand when everything else tells you to fall. That's humanity. That's who we are, and we're not going to let you, or anything else, take that from us. A silence hung between them, thick and heavy. The Vaughn officer stared at him, his expression unreadable. Then, with a final sneer, he cut the transmission. The screen flickered and went dark, but the words still echoed in Kaleb's mind. Dominance, conquest, those were the Vaughn's lies, their poison. Kaleb took a breath, his fists unclenching. The bridge around him was still, the crew waiting, uncertain of what came next. But Kaleb knew. They had been tested before, but this time, they weren't just fighting for survival. They were fighting for something far greater, their place in the stars, the promise that humanity would rise, not just survive. "We've heard them," Kaleb said, turning to face his crew. His voice was steady now, the weight of his words not just a command, but a truth. "And they're wrong. The universe doesn't decide our fate. We do." Daria met his gaze, her eyes burning with that same fire. "We rise together," she said, her voice unwavering. Kaleb nodded. "We rise together." Outside, the darkness of space stretched endlessly. But in the heart of the Valiant, in the hearts of those aboard, something had changed. The tension was gone, replaced with a steely resolve. They had faced impossible odds, but they hadn't just survived. They had fought for their future. And in that moment, Kaleb knew this was what made humanity different. They didn't just endure the void. They conquered it. The ship lurched as the engines roared to life, the sound breaking the stillness. Kaleb looked at the tactical screen, and this time the coordinates weren't filled with uncertainty. They were filled with purpose. "Plot a course," he ordered. "We're going to take the fight to them. No more waiting." The crew moved swiftly, their hands dancing over consoles, each one contributing to the mission with a shared sense of determination. As the Valiant surged forward, breaking through the darkness, Kaleb couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment. This was their turning point. The galaxy had watched as humanity had scraped and fought for its place in the stars. But now, they were more than survivors. They were a force to be reckoned with. "Captain," Daria said, her voice steady, "we've got an incoming signal. It's from Earth." Kaleb's heart skipped a beat. "Put it through." The screen flickered, revealing the face of Admiral Nakamura, his expression grim but filled with pride. "Captain Jarn," he began, his voice carrying the weight of everything they had fought for. "We've heard the reports, and I want you to know, the Earth is with you. We stand together. You're not alone." Kaleb's chest tightened. He felt the weight of the Admiral's words settle in. This was more than just a fight between humans and the Vaughn. This was a A declaration that humanity, in all its flaws, in all its glory, would never bow to anyone. "We rise together," Kaleb said, the words stronger now. "Always." The transmission cut off, but Kaleb didn't need it. He knew. The Valiant wasn't just a ship anymore. It was a symbol of humanity's will, its defiance. And as they hurtled toward the unknown, he knew one thing. The galaxy was about to find out just what humanity was capable of. For the first time in a long time, Kaleb felt his doubts melt away, replaced by a singular, unshakable truth. Humanity would rise. No matter the cost, no matter the enemy, humanity would rise, and nothing would stop them.